If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story. The sun dipped low over the small southern town of Harrow Creek, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement of Main Street. Jack Carter, a 68-year-old Vietnam War veteran, walked slowly but steadily toward the local Veterans Hall. His step had slowed with age, but there was still a quiet power in his gait. Jack was a man known by all in the community, a veteran who had spent his life contributing to his town and the people around him. He had seen the horrors of war, returned home with scars both visible and hidden, but he had always remained grounded, never asking for anything but respect. It had been a quiet day, the kind of peaceful routine Jack cherished. He spent the afternoon catching up with old friends, sipping coffee, and telling stories of days long past. The world had changed, but Jack had remained the same. There was a sense of calm in his bones as he made his way toward the park near the square. But today, as he walked toward the park, something was different. A small crowd had gathered near one of the benches, their eyes fixed on an escalating situation. Jack squinted, trying to make sense of the scene. In the center of the crowd stood Officer Roy McDougall, a stocky figure with a reputation for using force when words could have sufficed. Jack knew McDougall well. The officer had a long history of aggressive encounters, particularly with younger people who didn't fit into his narrow view of the world. As Jack walked closer, he could see the young man in McDougall's grasp. The boy was barely out of his teens, his body stiff and his hands shaking. McDougall's voice cut through the air, harsh and commanding. Jack didn't need to hear the words to know that the situation was about to escalate. "Hey, officer," Jack called out, his voice steady. "What's going on here?" McDougall turned, his cold eyes narrowing as he recognized Jack. "Mind your business, Carter," Roy growled. "This doesn't concern you." Jack stood his ground. "It does if you're about to hurt that kid," he said, motioning toward the trembling young man. For a moment, the crowd seemed to hold its breath. The tension was palpable. Jack, however, was unflinching. He had faced far worse in his life: war, loss, and hardship. He wasn't going to let an angry officer bully a young man just because he felt like it. Roy's face flushed, and without warning, he shoved Jack hard. Jack stumbled back, his body older, slower, but still resilient. The crowd gasped, some frozen, some stepping back. Before anyone could react, Roy swung a punch, landing squarely on Jack's face. The sickening sound of flesh meeting bone echoed in the air. Jack crumpled to the ground, his body hitting the pavement with a brutal crack. The crowd watched in shock as blood pooled beneath Jack's head. Panic spread quickly. Someone screamed for help. Others pulled out their phones, recording every moment of the assault. "Someone get the ambulance!" someone shouted. McDougall stood over Jack, his chest heaving, his anger now replaced by cold calculation. He knew what he'd done, and he knew that no one would challenge him. Not in this town, but what McDougall didn't know was that the man he had just put in a coma was not just a veteran. He wasn't just some old man to be pushed around. Jack Carter had a son, and his son, Michael Carter, was a force that McDougall could never have imagined. Michael Carter had built a career on justice. At 42, he was the youngest attorney general in the state's history, known for his sharp mind and unyielding pursuit of accountability. From the moment he had been sworn in, he had dedicated himself to reforming the justice system, focusing on systemic corruption and abuse of power. He was no stranger to difficult cases, to battling the forces of darkness that seemed to dominate parts of the legal and political world. But nothing in his career had prepared him for the phone call he received that evening. He had been in his office reviewing a stack of case files when his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but the woman on the other end spoke quickly, her voice trembling with a hint of panic. "Mr. Carter, it's about your father. He's been hurt. Badly. You need to get to the hospital. It was a police officer, an altercation in the park." Michael's breath caught in his throat. His father, Jack, had always been a pillar of strength, respected by everyone in town, known for his calm demeanor and years of service to the country. The man had seen war, battled through hardships, and come back a stronger person for it. And now, in his golden years, Jack was the victim of police brutality? Michael's mind raced, but he maintained his composure. He was a professional, after all. His voice was steady as he asked for more details. He's unconscious, the woman continued. They say it's bad, Mr. Carter. He's in a coma. The words felt like a punch in the stomach, stealing the air from his lungs. The rest of the conversation was a blur, but Michael didn't need more details. He hung up and grabbed his coat, his hands trembling for the first time in years. This wasn't just a case. This was his father, his world. He had to get to the hospital. The drive felt endless. The streets blurred around him as his mind focused on one singular thought. His father was fighting for his life, and it was all because of a police officer. A cop had beaten his father to the ground. Michael's jaw tightened with each passing second. He arrived at the hospital in what felt like an eternity, rushing into the emergency room. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed as nurses moved quickly around the sterile white hallways. Michael pushed through the automatic doors into the ICU, where the familiar faces of his father's friends and fellow veterans stood vigil. They were waiting, praying. Michael, one of them, Tom Jenkins, said quietly as Michael walked into the room. He's hanging on, but it's bad. The doctors can't tell us much. They're doing everything they can, but Tom trailed off, his voice heavy with concern. Michael nodded, unable to speak, his eyes locked on his father's still form. Jack Carter, a man who had been larger than life in Michael's memories, now lay in a hospital bed with tubes running from his arms, his face pale. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, but to Michael it sounded more like the ticking of a time bomb. Jack had been his hero. His father had taught him everything about right and wrong, integrity, honor, justice, and now, because of a police officer's rage, he was fighting for his life. Michael clenched his fists at his sides. His heart burned with anger, but he knew better than to let it show. He had spent years building a career on control, on logic, and on strategy. But this was personal. This was his father. A nurse came into the room, interrupting Michael's thoughts. Her face was somber as she approached. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "I'm so sorry about your father. He's stable for now, but the head injury is severe. We're doing all we can, but you need to prepare yourself. The prognosis is uncertain." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of her words press down on him. He fought to keep his composure. There was still work to be done. "I need to know who did this," Michael said, his voice quiet but firm. The nurse hesitated before answering. "It was Officer Roy McDougall, sir. We don't know all the details, but there's video footage. The entire incident is on camera." Michael's mind reeled. Roy McDougall, the name sent a cold chill down his spine. He'd heard of him before. McDougall had a reputation for using excessive force, especially with young black men, and had been a fixture in local controversies for years. Michael's heart burned with the knowledge that this officer had beaten his father, someone who had dedicated his life to serving the community. Michael knew this wasn't just about his father. It was about the entire system that had allowed McDougall to continue his violence without consequence. Michael had always fought for justice, but now it was personal. This was not just a case. This was war. He turned on his heel, exiting the hospital room. His mind was set. He wasn't just going to fight to bring McDougall to justice. He was going to dismantle the system that had allowed officers like him to operate with impunity. "Get the team together," Michael said as he pulled out his phone, already texting his closest advisors. "We're going after McDougall. We're going after the whole damn system." The next few days were a blur for Michael. He spent every moment coordinating with his legal team, gathering evidence, and meeting with witnesses. It was clear that the corruption went deeper than just one officer. McDougall wasn't acting alone. He had been part of a long-standing culture within the department of protecting officers who used excessive force, who abused their power, and who disregarded the lives of those they were meant to serve and protect. The community began to rally behind Jack. People who had known him for years stood together, organizing protests, demanding justice for the veteran who had given so much for his country. The town, which had been quiet and complacent for so long, had awoken. It was as though the injustice had finally reached a breaking point. But as the protest grew, so did the tension. Michael knew this would be a long, difficult fight. The police department, the mayor's office, even local politicians. Too many people had a vested interest in keeping the status quo. But Michael wasn't going to back down. He had seen too much injustice in his career, and this time it hit too close to home. McDougall had no idea what he had set into motion. He had no idea that the son of the man he had put in a coma was someone with the power to tear down the entire system. The streets of the town were buzzing with an energy that Michael had never seen before. The news of Jack Carter's brutal assault had spread like wildfire, and now everyone knew his name. Protesters marched in the streets, demanding justice, holding signs with Jack's face printed across them. The injustice of the situation had awakened something in the community, a shared sense of outrage and unity. But Michael knew this was only the beginning. The video footage of the attack had gone viral. Every news outlet had picked it up, dissecting every second of Officer Roy McDougall's violent assault. Michael had seen the footage too many times to count. His father, Jack, standing in the park, trying to defuse a situation between the young man and McDougall, only to be shoved and punched, his body crumpling to the pavement. The image of his father's head hitting the ground, the blood pooling around him, was etched into Michael's mind. It was a horrifying sight, but it was nothing compared to the burning fury inside him. McDougall had thought he could get away with it, but now it was Michael's turn to make sure justice was served. Michael sat at his desk in his office late that night, poring over the evidence. His mind was sharp, but it was also clouded with emotion. This was his father who had served his country with honor, who had fought in Vietnam, who had lived through so much, and now, as a senior citizen, was lying in a hospital bed in a coma because of one officer's rage. Michael gripped the papers in front of him, his knuckles turning white. Michael, his lead investigator, Sarah Thompson, said as she entered the room, her voice pulling him out of his thoughts. "We've got everything we need on McDougall. We've gone through his personnel files, the internal reports. It's worse than we thought. This isn't just about one rogue cop. McDougall has been protected for years." Michael's eyes hardened. How bad? Multiple complaints, excessive force, racial bias, they were all swept under the rug. The chief has been covering for him, and we've found records of complaints that never made it to the review board. It's a pattern that goes back for years. Michael stood up, his voice cold and calculated. Then we're going after the whole department. McDougall is just the start. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. The pressure on Michael grew with each passing hour. The protests outside the police station grew larger, their voices echoing in the streets. People were angry, and rightfully so. The community had trusted the police to protect them, and now that trust had been shattered. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about an entire system that had allowed McDougall to continue his abuse without consequence. Michael was not just fighting for his father anymore. He was fighting for the entire town, for everyone who had suffered under the heavy hand of a corrupt system. And he wasn't going to stop until the truth was exposed. Meanwhile, Roy McDougall sat in his apartment, his head buried in his hands. He had been suspended from the force, but that was just the beginning. The weight of what he had done was sinking in. The public outrage, the protests, it was all too much. He had always been able to rely on his position to get him out of trouble. But this time was different. This time the system was coming for him. And what made it worse was that he had no idea who was really coming for him. Michael Carter, the Attorney General, the son of the man he had put into a coma. Roy had no idea how deep this went. He had been a cop for too long, protected by the blue wall. But now that wall was crumbling, and Roy had no escape. He was in over his head. Michael stood outside the courthouse a few days later, preparing for his next move. The atmosphere was tense. Reporters crowded the steps, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions at him. But Michael was unfazed. His legal team had already begun filing the charges against Officer McDougall, and they were preparing a case that would expose the full extent of his misconduct. "We're filing the charges," Michael said firmly into the cameras. "We're not just holding McDougall accountable. We're holding the entire department accountable for their role in protecting him. There will be no more cover-ups, no more excuses." The crowd of reporters hushed, their pens scratching across their notepads. The message had been delivered. Michael was not going to stop until justice was served, and he had the power to ensure it happened. Inside the police station, Chief Leland Green watched the news conference with a sinking feeling in his stomach. Michael Carter was relentless. He had no idea how much the department had already covered up, how far back the corruption went. But now it was all coming to light. "You've got to lay low, Roy," the chief said, his voice tight with anxiety. "This is bigger than just you. We need to control the narrative. We need to make sure the story doesn't spiral out of control." Roy McDougall sat in the corner of the room, his face pale and strained. He had always thought he could get away with it, but now, with the full weight of Michael Carter behind him, he knew his career, and perhaps his freedom, was on the line. "Lay low," Roy muttered bitterly. "I'm screwed either way, aren't I?" The chief didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. Michael was sitting in his office when the call came. It was from the hospital. His father's condition had taken a turn for the worse. The doctors weren't sure if Jack was going to make it. Michael's breath caught in his chest, and for a moment everything else fell away. His father, the man who had taught him everything he knew about justice, about standing up for what was right, was now on the brink of death because of a corrupt police officer. He stood up, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just a case anymore. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about everything he had fought for: the integrity of the justice system, the truth, and the people who had been oppressed for so long. He was going to make sure that McDougall paid for what he had done, and he wasn't going to stop until the entire system was exposed for the corruption that had allowed this to happen. The hospital room was eerily quiet as Michael sat by his father's side, the hum of the machines and the steady beep of the heart monitor, the only sounds in the sterile room. His father, Jack Carter, lay unconscious in a coma. The once strong and proud veteran of the Vietnam War, a man who had faced war and adversity without flinching, was now lying fragile and motionless, all because of a senseless act of police brutality. Michael had spent days by his side watching his father's slow and uncertain recovery, but with each passing day, the case against Officer Roy McDougall was becoming clearer. The justice system had failed his father, and now it was time for Michael to make it right. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Sarah Thompson, his lead investigator, and her voice was grim when he picked up. "Michael, we've uncovered something big, the internal documents from the police department. There's more than we thought. It goes deeper. McDougall isn't the only one with a history of abuse. There's a whole group of officers who've been protected, and it's not just about the physical brutality. The racial profiling and misconduct go back for years. McDougall was just the tip of the iceberg." Michael's heart sank. He knew the corruption in the department went deep, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it all the more real. He had hoped naively that McDougall's assault on his father might have been an isolated incident, a rogue officer going too far. But no, this was systemic. It was the result of a culture of cover-ups, a culture where certain officers were given free rein to terrorize the community without fear of repercussion. "Get me everything you've got, Sarah. We need to bring this whole system down. The public needs to see what's really happening behind closed doors," Michael said, his voice tight with resolve. The next few days were a blur. Michael and his team poured through evidence, gathering witness testimonies, internal reports, and video footage. Each new discovery seemed to add another layer of corruption to the case. McDougall had been abusing his power for years, targeting young black men, using excessive force, and getting away with it all because the department's leadership had been too complicit to do anything about it. As Michael and his team gathered the evidence, the city itself was beginning to stir. The protests outside the police station had intensified. The streets were alive with angry voices demanding answers. The town had never seen anything like this before. For the first time, the people of the community were standing up to the institution that was supposed to protect them, and they were doing it in Michael's father's name. At the courthouse, Michael had prepared to confront the system head-on. He called a press conference to announce the official charges against Officer McDougall, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Reporters from every outlet filled the room, their cameras flashing, their microphones poised to capture every word. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael began, his voice steady but filled with the weight of what was at stake. "We are filing charges against Officer Roy McDougall for assault, misconduct, and violations of civil rights. But this is not just about one officer. This is about the system that allowed him to continue his violent behavior without consequence. We will be investigating the entire department, and we will hold every person responsible for this abuse accountable. This is not just about justice for my father, it's about justice for this entire community. The room erupted in questions, but Michael silenced them with a single forceful gesture. We're not backing down. We will dismantle this system of corruption, and we will make sure no one is above the law. No one is untouchable anymore. As Michael left the press conference, he could feel the weight of the community's eyes on him. The momentum was building, but it wasn't enough to win this fight, not yet. He needed more. He needed to tear down the walls of protection that the department had built around its corrupt officers. Across town, Officer Roy McDougall sat in his small apartment, staring blankly at the television. His world had turned upside down in a matter of days. The videos, the protests, the press, everything was coming down on him. He had always been able to rely on the blue wall, the unspoken code of silence that had protected him and other officers like him for years. But now, with Michael Carter leading the charge, that wall was collapsing. And McDougall was alone. His lawyer had warned him that he could face serious charges, but Roy couldn't fathom the reality of what was happening. He had never been held accountable for his actions, not in all his years on the force. But now the full force of the law and of the community was bearing down on him. The door to his apartment creaked open, and Roy's lawyer, a balding man in a cheap suit, stepped inside. He looked just as tired as Roy felt, his face lined with stress. "Roy," the lawyer began, "the evidence is stacking up against you. The videos, the witness statements, they're all damning. You're facing a criminal trial and the public is demanding your arrest. We have to make a deal." Roy's eyes widened. "What do you mean, a deal?" "We need to minimize the damage," the lawyer said. "If you cooperate, if you provide information on the department's leadership and how they've covered for you, we might be able to get you a plea deal. But if you continue to fight, you're looking at a lengthy sentence." Roy was silent, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had never been one to cooperate, but now, with the walls closing in, he realized he had no other choice. "I'll do it," Roy said, his voice low. "I'll give you everything." The next morning, Michael received a call from Sarah, her voice urgent. "We've got him. McDougall is ready to cooperate. He's going to give up the entire department." Michael's heart raced as he listened to the details. This was the break they needed. McDougall had finally cracked, and he was ready to spill the truth about the department's corruption, about the officers who had protected him, and about the culture of impunity that had allowed abuse to flourish. "We're moving forward with the charges," Michael said firmly, "and we'll make sure every officer who was involved is held accountable." The fight for justice had just begun, and Michael knew that the road ahead would be long and grueling. But he was determined. His father's struggle was not in vain. He would make sure that McDougall's violence, the systemic corruption, and the injustice that had plagued his community would not go unpunished. This wasn't just a fight for one man. It was a fight for a whole community, a fight for justice that would shake the very foundations of the system. And Michael Carter would not stop until every last piece of it was exposed. The streets outside the courthouse were lined with protesters, their chants filling the air with a sense of urgency and defiance. For the first time in years, the town had seen the people come together, not just for a cause, but for a chance at real justice. Officer Roy McDougall, once untouchable, now found himself at the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything he had built. Inside the courthouse, Michael Carter's legal team was preparing for a battle that would make history. The evidence was overwhelming. McDougall had admitted to using excessive force. He had confessed to his role in abusing his power, and now his fate was in the hands of the justice system. But Michael knew this case wasn't just about punishing one officer. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed corruption to fester for decades. Sarah Thompson, Michael's lead investigator, was pacing back and forth in his office, a stack of documents in her hands. She had been working non-stop, sifting through years of police reports, internal memos, and whistleblower testimonies. The deeper they dug, the darker the truth became. McDougall wasn't the only one who had been allowed to abuse his power. There were several other officers in the department who had done the same, and they had been protected by the very institution that was supposed to keep them accountable. Michael, Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration. It's worse than we thought. We've got confirmation that McDougall wasn't acting alone. There's a whole network of officers involved. Some of them have been accused of racial profiling, excessive force, and harassment for years, and they've all been swept under the rug. They've been shielded by the department's leadership. This isn't just about McDougall anymore. It's about a system that's been corrupted from the inside out. Michael felt the weight of her words sink in. His father had always taught him that justice wasn't just about righting individual wrongs. It was about fixing the system that allowed those wrongs to happen in the first place. But this was beyond what he had expected. This was a cancer that had spread throughout the entire police force. We need to go public with this, Michael said, his voice resolute. The people need to know that this isn't just about one officer, it's about a broken system. We can't let them sweep this under the rug again. We've got the proof, and we're going to expose it. The next morning, Michael held a press conference that would shake the entire state. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Journalists filled the room, their eyes trained on Michael, ready to capture every word. The air was thick with tension, and Michael could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. I want to be clear, Michael began, his voice steady and filled with purpose. This is no longer just about the actions of one officer. This is about an entire police department that has allowed corruption, racial bias, and excessive force to thrive without consequence. We've uncovered years of misconduct, protected by a system that has failed to hold its own accountable. Officer Roy McDougall will face trial, but this is just the beginning. The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. Michael continued, his voice growing more forceful. We will be launching a full investigation into the police department's internal practices, including every report of misconduct that was ignored, every case of abuse that was covered up, and every officer who has used their power to intimidate and harm this community. We will not stop until those responsible are held accountable. As Michael finished speaking, the room erupted in questions, but he didn't answer them. Instead, he turned and walked away, the gravity of his words hanging in the air. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was a movement. Meanwhile, Roy McDougall sat in a small, dimly lit room in the police station, his head buried in his hands. His world had collapsed in a matter of days. His name was being plastered across every news outlet, and his actions were being dissected by reporters, activists, and the public. The video footage of him punching Jack Carter had gone viral, and now he was facing a criminal trial. But what terrified Roy even more than the public backlash was the truth he had begun to realize, that he was no longer protected by the system. The blue wall that had once shielded him was crumbling, and he was left exposed, vulnerable. Roy, his lawyer said, his voice low and tense, we need to talk about a deal. Roy looked up, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. I can't go to prison. I can't. I didn't mean to hurt him. I just lost control. The lawyer sighed, his face grim. The evidence is overwhelming. The videos, the witness statements, it's all pointing in one direction. But if you cooperate, if you testify against the department, we might be able to get you a lighter sentence. It's your only option. Roy's mind raced. He knew that the department had always protected him, but now with the truth coming out, he was on his own. He had no choice. He had to make a deal, or he would face the full weight of the law. I'll do it, Roy said, his voice barely a whisper. I'll tell them everything. As the investigation into the police department continued, Michael's team uncovered more and more evidence of systemic corruption. Officers had been using excessive force for years, targeting people of color, and getting away with it because they had been shielded by their fellow officers in the department's leadership. The truth was ugly, and it was going to hurt, but Michael knew it had to come to light. The town had changed in the wake of the protests and the media coverage. People who had once been silent were now speaking out, demanding justice for Jack Carter and for the countless others who had been victimized by the police. The department was under siege, and it wasn't just McDougall who was in the crosshairs anymore. It was everyone who had turned a blind eye to the corruption and abuse. Michael stood before the courthouse, surrounded by protesters, journalists, and his legal team. He had made his mark on this case, but the fight wasn't over yet. He had promised his father justice, and he intended to deliver on that promise. "Today is a turning point," Michael said, his voice ringing with conviction. "This is the beginning of real change. We will not rest until every officer who has abused their power is held accountable." The culture of silence ends now. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in unison, their support unwavering. For the first time in a long time, the community had hope. Real, tangible hope that change was not just possible, but within their grasp. Back at the police station, the chief of police, Leland Green, sat in his office, staring out the window at the growing crowd of protesters. The pressure was mounting, and he knew it was only a matter of time before his own role in the cover-up was exposed. He had failed to keep control of his department, and now, with the full force of Michael Carter's legal team closing in, it was only a matter of time before the entire system came crashing down. The phone on his desk rang, and Green picked it up with a sense of dread. It was McDougall's lawyer. "Roy's ready to talk," the lawyer said, his voice urgent. "He's going to testify against the department. You need to act fast." Green's heart sank. This was the end. The walls had finally come down, and there was nowhere left to hide. As the investigation progressed, Michael's resolve only grew stronger. He had promised his father justice, and he would not rest until it was achieved. The battle for justice was far from over, but with each passing day, the truth was coming to light, and the corrupt system that had allowed officers like McDougall to operate with impunity was beginning to crumble. In the end, Michael knew this fight was about more than just his father. It was about everyone who had suffered at the hands of a broken system. The fight for justice was a fight for everyone who had ever been silenced, oppressed, or forgotten. And as long as he had breath in his body, Michael Carter would keep fighting. For his father, for the community, and for the future. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable. Reporters filled every corner, cameras flashing, while protesters gathered outside, their voices rising in a chorus of demands for justice. The scene was one of chaos and anticipation, the weight of the community's hopes resting on what would unfold that day. The air was thick with the promise of change, but Michael Carter knew that the road to true justice was never easy. His father was still in a coma, fighting for life, and the battle against the system that had failed him was far from over. Inside the courtroom, the defense team for Officer Roy McDougall was preparing their case. Roy sat at the defendant's table, his once proud posture now deflated. His hands shook slightly, betraying the fear and guilt that had been gnawing at him since the attack. His lawyer had advised him to stay calm, to trust in the system, but it was clear to anyone with eyes that the world had shifted beneath him. The weight of his actions, the public outcry, and the realization that his past could no longer be buried were taking their toll. Michael sat at the prosecution's table, his eyes fixed on McDougall, who couldn't meet his gaze. Every ounce of anger and determination that had built up in Michael since the attack on his father was now focused entirely on exposing the corruption within the police force. The evidence was undeniable: surveillance footage, witness testimonies, internal reports. But it wasn't just about proving Roy's guilt anymore. This was about holding the entire system accountable for what it had done to his father and countless others like him. The judge entered the room, signaling the start of the trial. Her presence was imposing, yet Michael found himself almost detached, as if the world around him had slowed down. He knew this moment could change everything, but it was still unclear how it would all unfold. Would the jury be able to see the truth, or would they be swayed by the tangled web of lies and corruption that had protected McDougall for so long? As the trial began, Michael's team presented their case with precision. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, reinforced the narrative that Officer McDougall had acted with extreme prejudice. They highlighted his past behavior, his repeated violations of protocol, and the racial biases that had driven his actions. The courtroom was silent as the footage of Jack's assault played once again, a haunting reminder of the injustice that had unfolded in the park. The defense, however, was determined to paint a different picture. They tried to discredit the witnesses, implying that the crowd was biased, that the footage was unclear, and that McDougall had been acting in self-defense. They even attempted to make Jack's actions in the park the focus, questioning whether he had provoked the officer. It was a pathetic attempt to turn the narrative, But Michael was ready. In the midst of the trial, as McDougall's lawyer delivered his closing argument, Michael's thoughts drifted back to the events leading up to that moment. He recalled the phone call that had changed everything. The call from the woman who had informed him that his father was in critical condition. He remembered the feeling of helplessness, of knowing that his father, a man who had fought for his country, was now fighting for his life because of the very people who had sworn to protect him. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, pushing aside the grief, the rage, and the exhaustion. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about the system, about every single person who had been wronged, who had been made to feel small and powerless. This was a fight for them. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Outside the courthouse, the protests continued to swell, their voices echoing through the streets. The pressure was building. Everyone was waiting for the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. Would McDougall be held accountable? Would the system finally begin to change? Michael paced in the back of the courtroom, his mind racing. He had done everything he could, but there was still a nagging uncertainty in the back of his mind. What if the jury didn't see it the way he did? What if the system was too entrenched, too corrupted to be changed? As the hours dragged on, the door to the jury room finally opened. The foreman stepped forward, his face grim. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. The moment of truth had arrived. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Roy McDougall, guilty of assault, misconduct, and racial discrimination, the foreman announced, his voice steady but filled with gravity. A wave of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. Michael felt a surge of relief wash over him, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Roy McDougall would face justice, but the system that had protected him would now be under scrutiny. The conviction of Officer Roy McDougall was a victory, but it was one that came at a steep price. The town was divided, torn between those who saw the trial as a triumph for justice and those who felt it was a betrayal of the police force. The fallout from the trial was far-reaching, and Michael found himself at the center of a storm. The protests that had started outside the courthouse continued to grow, with calls for reform echoing through the streets. The police department was under siege, and the calls for transparency and accountability were louder than ever before. But as the dust settled, Michael knew that the real work was just beginning. The department was crumbling, and the system that had allowed McDougall to act with impunity was beginning to unravel. The police chief, Leland Green, had resigned in disgrace, and the department was under investigation for its handling of McDougall's previous complaints. But Michael wasn't satisfied. He knew that true justice would only come when the entire system was held accountable. In the days following McDougall's conviction, Michael returned to the hospital to visit his father. Jack was still in a coma, but there were signs of improvement. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but the road to recovery was long. Michael sat by his father's side, reflecting on everything that had happened. The fight for justice had cost him dearly, but it had also opened his eyes to the truth. This wasn't just about one man. It was about an entire system that had failed to protect the people it was supposed to serve. Michael knew that the town had been shaken to its core, but from the ashes of corruption and violence, there was a glimmer of hope. The community had come together, demanding justice and standing up for what was right. And as long as Michael had breath in his body, he would continue to fight for that change. The road ahead would be long, the scars of the past would take time to heal. But Michael was ready. He had promised his father that he would fight for justice, and he would keep that promise, no matter what. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The struggle for justice was far from simple. It was filled with obstacles, grief, and intense emotional tolls. But through it all, Michael knew one thing for certain. Real justice could never be achieved until the very system itself was rebuilt. He was now the voice of change in his father's legacy, shaped by his strength, courage, and commitment to justice, would be the guiding force that carried him forward. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.